Let's begin.
Okay.
Sorry, apologies for the slight delay with our webinar. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. We have a very interesting topic, Ethiopia Quo Vadis, as many of you might have followed from the news in the last year. A simmering conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia has evolved through many contortions into a larger conflict. Although the situation is very fluid and very complex, we are joined today by two of our experts from our African Studies program to sort out and give some clarity to the developments that are happening in Ethiopia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Faisal Tesfaye, who is our program director in African Studies, and Dr. Samson Bezabe, also from our African Studies program. They've both worked in their own research on different aspects on Ethiopian politics and history, and they are able to provide us with a lot more insights into the developments that are currently going on, and that will make it easier for us to put things into perspective. So I would like to begin by inviting Dr. Tesfaye with a few remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Roland. Welcome everybody to this session on Ethiopia. I'm sure that everyone is concerned, right? You're sharing the concerns that we're having regarding what is happening in Ethiopia, that was, in a sense, that has long been a country of stability, suddenly becoming the poster of instability, right? I would like to begin by making a few remarks that I think are key in terms of understanding what is happening on the ground. Now, after almost 30 years of peace, relative peace in the country, Ethiopia has seen an escalation of violence and an open conflict that started in November 2020 and which is still ongoing. Very briefly, I think it's important to introduce the protagonists. Who is fighting who? Now, when we try to map the war on the ground, what we see is, on the one hand, the Ethiopian government, and on the other hand, what we are seeing is a group called the Tigray Liberation Front, which was the leading party that was governing Ethiopia for the past 27 years. They are the active players, and then you also have a couple of others like the Oromo Liberation Army, which is a faction of what used to be known the Oromo Liberation Front, a faction of the military front of that party. And next to that, you also, from time to time, you see a couple of names popping up, like liberation armies that we had never heard of, including the Command Liberation Front and some others as well. So basically, the conflict is between the TPLF, that has now declared itself as government. It used to be a regional government, but it's now considering itself as a Tigray government, and the Ethiopian official federal government. So that is a short introduction of the protagonists. Of course, there have been tensions, political tensions between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government, because 3 years ago, with the arrival of the new prime minister, this group, the TPLF, that was leading the country, has moved back to its region, retreated in its region, and it was engaged in a kind of a political conflict. At least it wasn't a full conflict, it was a political disagreement that existed and that was brewing in the past 3 years. So the reality on the ground is, the TPLF against the federal government. A second point that I would like to mention here, and this is something that we can flesh out during the discussions, concerns narratives. This is not just a war between a group and another one, it's also a war of narratives. A war of narratives in which, where every protagonist is defending one narrative. You have, on the side of the Ethiopian government, you have some sort of, one could describe it as a unitary narrative, united Ethiopia, diverse but one kind of narrative that is being perpetuated. And on the other hand, from the side of the TPLF, what we are seeing is a kind of a federal/confederal type of narrative, where the group, each group is, we can call it an ethno-national narrative, right? So these are really the two narratives that are conflicting and that haven't found a political solution and moved on to a war. These two narratives, and I will stop my intervention there, are backed up by different international actors. And this is something that is very important to mention at this point. The ethno-national narrative seems to be backed up by Western powers, the US, the European Union, even the UN seems to side with this ethno-national narrative. I personally do not think that it has something to do, it's not a certain a tendency of liking one narrative more than the other, but probably it has something to do with the fact that the TPLF has been in power for the past 27 years. And during those years, they were able to create a network in the Western world that allowed them to make their voices heard at a lot stronger than anyone else. On the other side, on the side of the unitary or one Ethiopia narrative, now we are seeing other major international players participating. And among them, we find the Chinese, the Russians, and also some other actors from the Arab world. So, that is a very it has created a very explosive dynamic where you have the supporters of one side would be pushing the point of views of one of the protagonists. That's where, for instance, you start seeing things like, genocide taking place or genocide in Tigray and things like that. And this leads us to my last point that I would like to mention here, but of course that I'll be happy to develop afterwards. It is the role of social media, and maybe we should call it, we have reached the age of disinformation. Suddenly the person who shouts, or the group that shouts the loudest, tends to get more credibility, even when that group is not, saying the truth. And here it's important to maybe highlight how social media, as well as the traditional media, the role that both of them have played in pushing one side and in disfavor of the other. And for that, at a later stage, I can also give the example of what I have observed personally. I was, and let me finish with that. I was in Addis in early November of this year. And the day I arrived, I think CNN announced that the rebels have surrounded Addis, or that they have reached Addis. And there was a lot of panic. The embassies were pulling out their members. The UN was asking all of its non-essential members to leave Addis. But the reality on the ground was different. The rebels were not in Addis. So I think, there's a certain pressure that was being exerted at that point on the Ethiopian government as well. So, I'm just throwing all of these on the table, and we can discuss them in depth. Thank you.
Thank you. We would really like to later also hear some of your impressions and observations during your last trip to Ethiopia, and in particular, like the rapid change in the situation, that basically within a month's time, it seemed to be like from the rapid advance of the rebels towards their withdrawal to the northern region of Tigray again, how could we explain that? But I would also like to invite, after Dr. Bezabe's impulse, which is coming next, for our audience to participate. You can turn on your cameras and raise your hand, but also use the chat function. But before we get to that, I would like to invite Dr. Bezabe with a few impulses and observations of his own. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fasil, for the interesting presentation. I agree with many points that Fasil has raised, and let me start by just quoting the title of that was published on CNN, and the title says, "Ethiopia is at war with itself." So this is a very interesting title in the sense that it asks why Ethiopia is fighting a war, but then it says why Ethiopia is at war with itself. So it reveals something, of course, but then of course there's an element that it also hides because it internalizes the dynamics and the conflicts that is happening in Ethiopia. So part of the narratives that are developed are the narratives that seems to internalize the conflicts without looking at how this internal conflicts has also an outside dimension in which many other actors are also participating. So I think one thing that we should question is this internalization of conflicts in Ethiopia, and we have to maybe adopt a multidimensional perspective. And this is a very endemic problem within Africa and African studies because conflicts tend to be internalized. So when it's conflict in Africa, it's a tribal war. When it's conflicts outside Africa, of course, it's not a tribal war. So there is that dimension that comes in and that plays out itself in some of the media coverage of the Ethiopian conflicts. So we need to have, from my perspective, a broader comparative and historical analysis and situate the war of Ethiopia within the broader historical framework and the African continent as well. And one element that, for example, for me reveals this is this issue of decline, because Ethiopia, for example, is said to be in a high economic progress before the war, and all of a sudden we have a decline. So people are wondering about that. And of course, this is a point to wonder. How come there is a peace and prosperity, and then all of a sudden we have war and conflicts? And again, we have to situate this within the broader African framework, I think, in order to understand it, because this is a narrative that is not just developed now, but that has existed in Africa long before. Yeah. So, for example, it brings to my mind the book of James Ferguson, Expectation of Modernity, where, for example, Ferguson talks about how Zambia was once prosperous and then it suddenly collapsed. We have seen the same kind of change and wonder in the case of Zambia that he described, but also in the case of Ivory Coast that suddenly collapsed, and so on. So we have to ask why this narrative of wonder, in which there is a sudden boom and then conflicts appear again and again. So what I'm saying is that this has happened in Ethiopia, but then is part of a larger happenings that were also occurring in different parts of Africa, as in the case of Zambia, which James Ferguson described, Ivory Coast, you know, we can go on. So he calls this the ethnography of decline. So I think we need to think of this decline ethnographically or through a broader scholarship, and not just simply, we should not be able to take it simply. So the narratives have power to shape the conflicts, as my colleague Fasil says, and these are intricate. Yeah, it's internalized the conflict, it creates wonders in the conflict, and it, by internalizing it, then we forget the external actors which are also involved. Yeah, so we have many actors that were involved in the current conflict. Yeah, and the narratives only tells us half of the story, because we don't know some of the elements of these conflicts, because we can only guess what are they, because some of them are like state secrets. So there are a lot of external players and external dimensions, so which we can guess of. So one is, for example, is the issue of the Nile Dam, which is the Great Renaissance Dam, which is constructed over the Nile, and in which Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt are in conflict with. So we should be able to question and ask whether this has anything to do with the conflict. Of course, we cannot have a direct indication of this, but then there are, you know, some possible indications about these issues. And then we have the involvement of the Arab countries, particularly UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. And then we should also ask their role and their interest. Does it play in the conflict? And then we should also remember that in 2018, there was an agreement that was signed between Eritrea, the Ethiopian government, and the Somalia to create a broader coalition within the Horn of Africa. So one thing that we have to ask is also whether this conflict has to do with that. Certainly, we cannot answer these questions because we don't even know what those agreements are. Yeah, but we have manifestations. So, for example, the West was aligned with Abiy Ahmed when it came to power, Trump administration was pro-Abiy and against the TPLF rebel groups. So the last tweet of Mike Pompeo, for example, I remember it was very anti-TPLF. But when the administration, the current administration, the US administration came to power, things seems to have changed. And then we have a reverse, of course, in which now the West is backing. Why this has happened? Does it relate to any of the external element that I have mentioned? Or is it because it's an administrative issue that different kind of groups have taken power in the US? So is it the kind of networking that has been going on for a long period of time that has matured now? So these are some of the questions that we should be able to ask. And of course, in asking this, we should also ask, what is the nature of the politics now? Are we talking about US affecting, for example, Ethiopia, or is it issues of administration, different political parties coming into the US and having different policies? So what is it? So these are some of the challenging questions that exists that I think will be solved in due time. So for example, will the war and the way it's developed change when the Democrats, let's say, lose power and the Republicans will come to White House? So what is it? So we have a lot of questions that are not answered. So the narrative tells us something. For example, it tells us, the masking of the external elements, the internalization of African conflicts, and as Fasil, for example, mentioned, it has an alarmist tendency where there is no rebel group even coming to near the city, but then they have, of course, arrived on the television screen via CNN news and so on. So, but then these narratives, although they are important and they tell us something, there are also very many unknown things that are behind the scene, which only time will tell. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move to Q&A, I just wanted to quickly ask you, Fasil, about when you were there in Ethiopia recently, a couple of weeks ago. What was the mood? What was the mood on the street? What was described to us a little bit, like what your impressions were?
Thank you, Roland. So I landed, I think I landed on the 2nd or the 3rd of November. And I arrived on the day the government had just put up not a curfew, but a kind of what is it called? Yeah, some sort, it was, they had a new, a state of emergency. Well, so they had just put up a state of emergency, and the mood was pretty down because people were not really understanding what was happening. And the fact that the government had put a state of emergency had created a kind of a tension. But that being said, it was more of the mood on the ground in the days that followed that declaration of state of emergency was pretty normal. CNN would announce the arrival of that Addis was surrounded, but everyone was looking around, wondering and making jokes as well, right? Because what was being, this alarmist sound horn that was being blown on the one hand was not reflecting the reality on the ground. Now, another thing that I think I should mention here is that I personally experienced the arrival of I experienced the fall of Mengistu and the arrival of the TPLF and its allies in Addis. Now, you know, when you have that as comparison, what I was seeing last month was different. There was absolutely nothing. You know, the narrative was the same. The talk was the same. The mood that was created was the same, but the reality on the ground was a different one. So Addis people were, you know, at the beginning a bit disturbed, but then realizing that this is just talks, there isn't something, you know, as Samson said, there were other things that were being, you know, that was playing behind. When I was there, it was also the time when Biden's East Africa envoy, Feldman, was in Addis, right? It coincides with me arriving there is nothing, but when I was there, Feldman was in Addis negotiating. I mean, he was in the news, but then this period also coincided with the signature of a coalition being signed, a coalition of groups signing a kind of an official declaration in the US. And among the 8 groups that signed it, the TPLF was the only, you know, group that people knew about as opponent to the government, right? So you have them signing this agreement in Washington, Feldman arriving in Addis, the news of Addis being taken, being sung by CNN and all the media, makes you, you know, creates a kind of an environment where you can guess that something is happening behind the scene and that we are not really seeing the real implications or who is doing what, you don't know. And that's the kind of feeling that I observed while I was in Addis.
When you, just a quick follow-up question, because you also mentioned the role of social media in the whole context at the moment. I've heard that there's a pretty wide blanket media blockout. So how do people get information?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think there is a media blackout when it comes to announcing anything that is done by the government. On the other hand, there is no blackout when it comes to reflecting point of views by the rebel groups. One interesting anecdote here is that a few days, last week, I think, the porte-parole of the rebels announced that they have killed 80,000 Ethiopian soldiers. And the joke in Addis that I heard from my friends in Addis was that, oh, we should put tents, because, you know, when someone dies in Ethiopia, you put a tent in front of the house. And basically my friend was joking, saying, you know, we should put wheels on the tents that we're going to install in front of people's houses, because with 80,000 dead, we will have to push the thing in front of every door. So the, you know, the media did not openly talk about the 80,000, but in general, anything that comes from the Tigrayan side is receiving more attention. And where you see that, for instance, is the UN calling, the UN Human Rights Commission calling a meeting on the Ethiopian human rights situation. But Ethiopian NGOs are not involved. All of those who brought in témoignages or witnessing the atrocities that have happened in Ethiopia are either Egyptian NGOs or groups based in Cairo. So I think, and that brings us to what Samson said earlier, which is there are other, although the war, the fight, the actual war is local, the non-local agents play a huge role as well. Because, for the UN to call, to have 11, the UN Security Council had, if I am correct, please correct me, Samson, if I'm wrong, at least 10 to 11 meetings regarding
Ethiopia. One was the 12.
12, okay, thank you. So 12 special meetings on Ethiopia this year. And when you know how difficult and how complex it is to get that machine, that complex machine that is the UN, to act on something, basically, it shows you that other actors are involved. To answer to your question, where do people get their information? I think we should not forget the role of lobbyists and activists. You have a lot of lobbyists and activists for both sides that are active on the internet. You have a lot of YouTube forums, Telegram forums, etc., with people commenting both sides of the aisle or representing both groups. And at least in Addis, where I was, I have seen people, the way people get their information is you hear a bit of Ethiopian TV, which would be a propaganda thingy, which gives you government position plus plus. You hear a bit of CNN, which gives you anti-government news plus plus. And then you go and hear activists left and right, and you will position yourself somewhere in the middle. So people are juggling between information, and you see everyone more or less being trying to get as much information as possible from various points.
I have already a couple of questions, and I want to invite all of our panelists, all of our participants to please ask questions. Let me just read one question from the chat, and it reads, outside players have long been active in Africa, and we're all aware that the Cold War was well played by proxy in the Horn of Africa. More recently, the Red Sea has come to play a role in the geopolitics of the wider Southwestern Asia, Arabian Peninsula region. Do you see this as a possible extension of this strategy that is already active in Yemen, perhaps even in South Sudan? So is there a bigger geopolitical situation here that the Ethiopian conflict fits into? Who wants to?
I think there is. I think there is, because it has, the conflict has been in the making for a very long period of time. It's only surfaced now, and one of the indication of this has been the building of different military bases in the Horn of Africa region. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on were having military bases in different parts, including the different groups. So Qatar has military, military involvement. The Turks has a military base in Somalia. UAE has the same involvement, and so on. So the region has been hosting for a long period of time these military bases recently, and this of course relate with what's happening in Yemen and the Yemen conflict. For example, Saudi have used as a launching pad for the conflict in Yemen. So the region is certainly drawn in this conflict. But the question to ask is how this involvement or active involvement of the Arab countries will be responded by the West and other actors involved in the region as well. Yeah. So is this involvement and broader conflict an attempt to create an Arab Red Sea and maybe oust the West out of this? And the West are sensitive because of this. We don't know. This is just a question. I'm just thinking. Is it an attempt to grab power or to control the Horn of Africa by different groups? I think it is, because the Turks, for example, shortly were involved with the Sudan, and the Sudan they had a military agreement with Sudan, including opening a big military base in Sudan. But then that failed, and now they are in Ethiopia. So these actors are changing positions, but they are certainly involved in the dynamics of the Horn of Africa. And in any case, this label of Africa, Horn of Africa, Red Sea, and Yemen are just artificial, because these are very closely linked regions. So, but then we are thinking of the conflict as if they are separate. Of course, they are separate, but then there is a broader region which has been historically integrated. Yeah. So to cross from Djibouti to Yemen by boat is just 3 hours. Yeah. So, and people come and go between the two regions very often. So the two regions, although they are separated by the Red Sea, they are in different continents, they are the same. So we have the conflict are in relation to each other, from my perspective, and the different actors that are involved in Southern Arabia are, of course, involved in the Horn of Africa. But the interesting thing is that the conflict cannot be played in a similar way as in Southern Arabia as well. Yeah. So I'm not trying to create a beige image where conflicts between the two regions will be the same. No, I don't think it's possible, because in the first place, for example, if you take the case of Djibouti hosts different military bases, yeah, of different countries who are opponent to each other. So if you try to open, if you try to
all next door, the Americans next to the Chinese, next to the French,
and so on. So if you want to create a conflict or an open conflict in the Horn of Africa, how it will play out? So it will be very difficult. So, but if you do it in Yemen or other region, it's a different ball game. So there is a relation, but there is also a dissimilarity between maybe the nature of the conflict, the way they are going to get involved, and so on. So my answer to this question will be yes. It's a part of a larger conflict which is developing, and I don't think it will end soon.
Maybe to add to that,
who would like to ask more questions? Anybody? You can also please raise your hand, or just feel free to switch on your microphone and ask the question directly, or alternatively use the chat function.
If I may,
sure.
I'd like to add a point to what Samson said. I think what we are seeing with this conflict is a sort of a remapping of the geostrategical map of this part of the world, because basically what we are seeing is the new actors, China, Turkey, and the Arabs, kind of taking over what used to be the pearl of the West, right? And I think this competition is the macro thing that you see over the head of this localized kind of conflict. I think there is an attempt to assert control over this region, and whoever wins the war in Ethiopia is asserting with its narrative and its actions that will follow later, a control over what's going to happen in this region. So there is definitely, this is really an attempt not to lose influence in this region. That is one. There was another question by Ku Sun Wei about the role of the Ethiopian diaspora in the Q&A section. The diaspora, the Ethiopian diaspora, is playing a very, very important role. And here, I think when we talk about diaspora, we should also talk about Tigrayan diaspora. Both Ethiopian diaspora and the diaspora of the people from Tigray have played huge roles in the various parts of this conflict. At the beginning, those who were louder and who were making a lot of noise and who have shaped the reactions of the international community are or were the diasporic Tigrayans. They were the ones, for instance, who started shouting genocide, right? They said that the Ethiopian government is conducting a genocide in Tigray, and that message was passed on to the major international actors through the diaspora. Think of now, a few months later, when you see what is happening in all major cities in the world, the Ethiopian diaspora has now woken up, and suddenly you have a lot of people, Ethiopians as well as Eritreans now, who are saying, you know, no more. We don't want neo-colonialism. Suddenly the discourse moved. It's not just about Ethiopia, it is about avoiding foreign or rejecting foreign influence on how a country is to be run. So the answer here, the short answer would be yes, Ethiopian diaspora are supporting both sides of the aisle, and they are under the current administration. I mean, the previous administration has also tried to use the Ethiopian diaspora for some of its politics, but this one has certainly managed to attract more people to its side, even when everyone does not agree with the prime minister. You know, so it's not, you know, it's not support for the prime minister as such, but it has now become, the Ethiopian diaspora is now defending or saying that it's defending Ethiopia, the country, the unity of the country, right?
Okay. More questions from our audience? Just trying to check that I don't miss anybody.
Is one on South Sudan?
Yes, I see some Chim, somebody known as Chim, please.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think you mentioned the war of narratives, and within this narrative, I think the point which is usually overlooked is what do both parties want, particularly when it comes to TPLF. What does the group want in this conflict? I think if we are going to solve this conflict, we have to identify the major interest of at least the two main actors. If you look at the news from the West, it seems that it is like the group is fighting for self-determination, when in fact it's not fighting for self-determination, because I don't think it Ethiopian government has a problem if TPLF is ruling Tigray. They are also not trying to break away from Ethiopia. We know that for a fact because they are not actively seeking for it. So I'm just contemplating, what do they want? What is their end game in this conflict? At least if we identify that, we can start the process of dialogue, or at least they can talk to each other. So what do you guys think? What this group specifically is interested in this conflict? Can you just give us some contemplations for that matter?
Thank you very much for that question. And may I just add to this? There's another question we have in the chat that goes in a similar direction and asks, what is the solution to bring some change? So, you know, would any of you speculate about what or draw some scenario about, like, you know, what are sort of like the root issues and what could a potential solution maybe look like? Samson, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think one thing that we know we should be careful is to give solutions, and it has become part of the problem because we have nowadays experts who have popped up everywhere. We have local experts who are on YouTube and giving solution and trying to also answer some of the questions. And we have Western experts who have never landed in Ethiopia, who have never researched on Ethiopia, but then they have become expert on Twitter and trying to answer these things. So one thing that I would like to caution is that giving the solution and giving recommendation might be part of a problem when all the factors are not known. Yeah, so there are many unknown factors. There are many things, of course, that we know. So we have to balance this problem. And of course, we have seen a lot of embarrassment these days because YouTube experts who have come out and gave us scenarios and directions and even predicted things online have clearly gone wrong in their discussions, and later on, you know, these videos have been replayed and so on. So there is a lot of fun-making process. So for me, the answer would be in scholarship, but scholarship is not a simple narrative. It's not a unidirectional narrative. For example, what does the TPLF want? I don't think they want one thing. I don't think we can say they want this and this and this, because it's a complex process in which they are engaged and in which the Ethiopian government are engaged as well. And this shifts over a period of time. Yeah, so it's not also something that is constant. So simple answers from my perspective would be very problematic. And of course, expert knowledge, which are claimed outside the academia, and also academia, like people like us claiming expertise, can also be problematic in this ongoing situation. Yeah, because we don't know all the factors. So it should not be a guessing game. We can only know once we know, you know, a good element of it, and for example, we have access to what is happening and so on. So I think for now, it will be best to problematize the issue and try to understand it as much as possible and give problems as a solution. Yeah. So our solution would be to problematize and think through these things and not say, I think X, Y, Z as are the factors or the solution for these things, which is very big.
Yeah.
Maybe to the person who asked this the question, you know, you asked what's the end game of the conflict, what does the TPLF want? I think, you know, when we are trying to get answers to those questions, we can only rely on whatever they're saying. Now, you said they don't want self-determination, they don't want independence, but at the same time, we have seen them hint, you know, on possible independence of Tigray from Ethiopia. We have seen them shout that, you know, this is something that they would be interested in doing. And we have even heard the president of Tigray asking for reparations for war or for a conflict that they have started. At least those are the basic facts. So it's difficult to say, you know, to go into their minds and give an answer to that question. But again, as Samson said, I think we would be considered witch doctors if we were to come up and say, okay, the solution is A, B, and C, whereas the actors are already, you know, envisaging something else. So that's for that question. Zalalem in the chat asked about the unreported conflicts that exist in the country in different regions, and asking if we can say that the conflict is limited to only the Ethiopian government and TPLF. For an uninformed observer, it may sound as if the conflict has metastasized and we are seeing new conflicts left and right. But if you keep the larger framework in mind, if you think how the TPLF, or if you remember that the TPLF was, and its allies were in power for 27 years and were ruling the countries, I don't think that it would be new to you or to anyone to understand that some of these groups that are causing problems in other parts of the country are related in one way or another with the TPLF, right? Take the Oromo Liberation Army, for instance. They have signed, or they have a month and a half ago, or 2 months ago, they had made an agreement with the TPLF to fight the war with them, etc., etc. They had officially become their allies. Think of the meeting that has taken place in Washington, DC, early November this year, where you suddenly had you know, liberation movements that no one had heard of in the past, who are probably based in, you know, who are probably grounded in existing small conflicts in the country, who have now taken a kind of a bigger dimension because of the alliance that they have created with the TPLF. So obviously the big chunk of the conflict is between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government. But then you have satellite actors who work for one group or the other, right?
We have another question from Bedru Mohammed. You have your hands up if you would like to ask your question, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Samson and Dr. Fasil for very clearly explaining the situation in Ethiopia. And I would like also to thank the School of Modern Language and Culture for organizing this kind of platforms. I think this is particularly important because of the seemingly intentional misinformation from the international mainstream media like CNN, BBC, and others. As it is clearly explained by Dr. Fasil, the major players of this conflict are the TPLF and also the Ethiopian government, which is led by the Prosperity Party. So basically, Prosperity Party is a very new party, and it has been in power for about 3 years now. So when we actually compare these two parties, the TPLF, which actually leads the country for 27 years under the umbrella of APRDF, and also the Prosperity Party, there is no clear major difference in their ideology. For example, Prosperity Party and also the TPLF, they both use the same constitution, which was ratified by the TPLF itself. So and also when you see the situation, like Prosperity Party was in power for a very short period of time. So there was no reason for the Tigrayan people to actually like or not like the Prosperity Party, not yet. So I was just wondering, why do you think we are having this kind of conflict in the absence of major difference between the two major players of this conflict in Ethiopia? Is it because the TPLF, which was in power for a very long time and is not accepting the reality, because TPLF represents only about 6-7% of the country, the population, and they still want to have the major say in every decision in the country, and the Prosperity Party actually doesn't allow them to do so. And the other question I have is actually currently the Ethiopian government defense force are actually pushing TPLF forces into the Tigrayan region right now. So having the international community, the UN and its agencies with the TPLF side, and the major mainstream media supporting TPLF, how do you predict that the government will be able to finish TPLF once and for all? Do you think it is possible to do so? That is what I would like to ask you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe Samson, your expertise on transitions in Ethiopia and beyond in Africa, maybe you want to begin with that question?
Yeah. So transition is always sold as a rosy picture. Yeah. And is everywhere. There is a romance on transition, and it's not just in Ethiopia, and is everywhere. So, for example, even the decolonization project, the entire decolonization project was sold on this idea that there will be a rosy future once the colonial state is gone. So. With this, there is a state solution that is brought in this framework. Yeah. So the solution, once transitions occur, one there is a rosy picture that is painted, and then if you have a state of some sort, things will be solved. Yeah. So from my perspective, that this is part of the problem, and it is being played out again and again in different parts of the region, but we don't take a lesson out of it. So let's take, for example, the transition from the Derg to the TPLF. The Derg, when the collapsed, there was a talk of peace and stability, which is generated by the TPLF. They called it Salam and Merregagat. And this was part of the narratives. And when they came, they had a huge support. Before that, when the Derg replaced Haile Selassie. They made, of course, a propaganda video and so on, and they demonized the past and made a transition which says Ethiopia will be first without bloodshed. And of course, whole set of bloodshed has arrived. So we keep having this transition. When Abiy came, we have the same kind of rosy picture that is painted. Yeah, and they call this Abiy mania. Yeah, so everyone was happy. People want to hug. Of course, this lasted for a while, even for the Tigrayans. But then suddenly things also change. So now there are a huge section of the population which is liked, which likes Abiy, and of course there are groups which hates it. Yeah. So transitions puts us always in across the world in two framework between romance and tragedy. Yeah, and we have a repeat. So from my perspective, I don't think there will be any solution to this or to the eradication of the TPLF idea or to the problems of conflicts that we see in the present. Why? Because these conflicts, although it is a conflict about TPLF, is a conflict about prosperity party, in real term is a conflict that is generated by the nation state. The conflict occurred because of the nation state framework. And the logic of the nation state is the problem. And this logic is always divisive. It's always divisive in the sense that it always creates hierarchies between citizens. And only one section or one segment of a population can control the nation state. Also, for that to occur, there will be some romantic discussion about everyone being happy. And at the end, of course, everyone will get disappointed. Yeah. So for me, the Ethiopian conflict will not end. And it will not have a solution. Conflict is part of the nation state. It is through which it's the butter and bread of the nation state, so to say, because the nation state creates hierarchies. It creates division between citizens, and only one group can control the nation state. Can you have democracy as a solution? There are many Democrat enthusiasts of democracy. I'm not one of them. I don't think it will create. It will create some form of stability, but not entirely. Yeah. So if you read, for example, I forgot the name, but these Essex schools on democracy and democratization, clearly democracy is sold for the world as one of the solutions for humanities, for the state problem and so on. But then it's not, of course. Yeah. So for me, the real conflict underlying this, our problem is the nation state framework, and its logic, and there will be no end to this. Yeah. So if TPLF go, if TPL or if Prosperity Party go, or all the actors will go, if you still maintain a modern nation state framework, you will be embedded in the same logic. Yeah. So the point would be for us to think beyond the nation state and to think a different forms of political practice that can be generated without enclosing oneself to the nation state framework. Yeah. And the nation state framework will never work. So for example, if TPLF says, oh, now self-determination is the solution and let me go out, they will have the same problem. Why? Because they still exist in the logic of the nation state framework. And we have seen this in the region. Yeah, the Eritreans, they got separation, and we have we know what happened to that project. We see the same thing in South Sudan. Yeah, South Sudan, everyone said, okay, new flag, new country, everyone will be happy. Well, it's just a matter of Googling what South Sudan news is today. So no, the solutions will not be materialized within the nation state framework. And I don't think the conflict will end anytime soon, or we will have another conflict and another romance at another time.
Thank you. We still have a few questions here on the chat that I would like to combine, all very interesting. So the first one deals with the economy and basically saying, like, what is the economic damage to Ethiopia that this conflict has, is engendering, in particular, given that Ethiopia used to have the fastest growing economy in the world only a few years ago. And so what is the economic damage? The second interesting question is about, like, what kind of support does the Tigrayan, the TPLF actually have in Tigray? And are there any other alternatives, any other alternative groups or political organizations that could potentially substitute them? So these are some questions I would like to throw out. Maybe Fasil, would you like to pick one of them or both, and then?
Okay, let me start with the economic damage. I think, like any such conflict, the economic damage of this conflict on the Ethiopian economy has been disastrous. I think we have seen the local currency being devalued. I mean, on top of infrastructures being destroyed, infrastructures that weren't sufficient being destroyed, universities, some universities that we as HKU group have visited are now destroyed by the war. So the economic damage is really tremendous. And I think it's going to take a lot of time to rebuild all this. At the same time, I think in this sense, I'm less pessimistic than Samson. At least I'm going to try to put a positive spin to it. Although the country has suffered economically a lot, the external forces that have backed up this economic wonder of Ethiopia are still there. And I'm thinking here of China. China has been backing Ethiopia for the past 10, 15 years, and now is still an economic, partnering with the Ethiopian government, supporting the Ethiopian government. So my positive spin to it would be, because we have the allies who helped us build, or who helped Ethiopia build this or reach the status, there will be, redoing this thing will be possible. Now, the TPLF support, whether all Tigrayans support the TPLF, I think one of the strongholds that the TPLF has is the control on, a control on the population. Now, the reason why they control the population is not necessarily ideological or political. It is simply by the TPLF has existed in Tigray for the past 50 years now. So you have a generation that was born and raised only knowing the TPLF as a political actor in that region. And therefore, for the time being, what we have seen is people supporting the TPLF by default. Any attack on the TPLF was considered as an attack on Tigrayan people. Which takes us to the question of Badru earlier on, whether a military solution is a solution. I don't think that a military solution, it was attempted a year ago, and it hasn't worked because of the control that the TPLF had over the population. The solution has to be political, and what form it's going to take, we do not know as such at this point. But one option could be, the Tigrayan people who have now suffered enormously under this crisis. I think I am sure that by now there is at least one dead in every family or one wounded in every Tigrayan family because of the war. So, you know, if a normal political process would take place and people would start asking, you know, the painful questions, why am I maimed? Why am I, you know, why is my son dead, kind of, that could change the dynamics there. But an entirely military solution is not going to solve this problem. And maybe to the question of the difference between the Prosperity Party, EPRDF, TPLF, I think, you know, the major problem of the TPLF with Prosperity Party is the position that it has in it, or that the position that it would have in it, right? In the EPRDF, meaning the previous government, the TPLF was, although it was a representative, you know, although it was representing only 5–6% of the population, was ruling the entire country. And the way the Prosperity Party has reshaped itself, although it's a, you know, it's EPRDF, it's the new EPRDF, if you will. They are using the same structure. The position of the TPLF was going to shift. And I don't think that they wanted to remain as a minority party, a party that has very little say in the way the country was going to be run.
So can I add one point on this one? So when we think of, for example, for the question of whether Tigrayans support TPLF, one thing I think for understanding this, one thing that we have to do is to make a distinction between ethnic and political identity. The Tigrayans, so how do we view the Tigrayans? Is this an ethnic identity? Before and after the violence, violence transforms you. So there is a different element, there is a different identity that is generated before and after violence. Yeah. So I don't think I think it will be very problematic to see the Tigrayan category as an ethnic, because now after the violence things will change. It will be more of a political identity, because violence transforms identities, and it engages you, it forces you to play on a different field. Yeah. And this is of course an old point that Hannah Arendt has mentioned. For those of you who have read Hannah Arendt on violence, on the Jew question and so on. So I think it's also wise to look at the Ethiopian problem, not in terms of an ethnic only, or of an ethnic identity, Tigrayans supporting XYZ, but through the violence as well, and the kind of identity that this violence generates. And it will take a lot of efforts to break and resolve that kind of identity that is formed through violence on both sides, on the different side. Yeah. So you can on a happy day, being an Amhara or being a Gurage or a Tigray is something else. But once violence is exercised on you, on your body, on your family, then there is a different game that comes in. Yeah. And we have seen this with the Jew case, the Hannah Arendt's theorization and so on. So I think we need a good dose of thinking of how we frame the question. And for me, it's not just a play of Tigrayan ethnic identity with, or Amhara ethnic identity vis-a-vis someone else. Yeah, although this is what we see in the media.
May I just invite the last question? We still have a hand up by a person called Apple. Please, if you would like to ask a question. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronald. It's me, Samira. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Fasil and Dr. Samson. And it was really a nice presentation. And I just want to add something on the question raised by Kim. The question was, what is the end purpose of TPLF fighting for? I think it's clear that, or in my opinion, can't we guess and say that they are fighting for power because they have explicitly told that they need power or they want to rule and govern the country for the coming centuries. So what do you think of this?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank
Who
you.
would like to take that first?
Well, thank you for your question, Samira. The problem is it is difficult to pick and choose from what they have said, right? A lot of things have been said, and nowadays they keep changing, right? Yes, they've said that they have put, one of the things that was officially circulating in Ethiopia was that the TPLF has put, or the EPRDF has put a structure that will allow them to keep power for the next 50, 100 years, right? But then this thing has slipped out of their hands, right? So the one thing I agree with, though, with you is that it is definitely true that the TPLF has major issues with the loss of power or loss of influence, political influence that has occurred to it in the past 3 years. It has attempted, it has tried to create coalitions, etc., that would enable it to counter this prosperity party kind of led group, but it definitely is the case that they have a problem with losing the say in Ethiopian politics as they had in the past.
For me, I think TPLF in itself as a category, we should question it at this stage, because I think we are talking of TPLF as in former terms. Yeah, that's the TPLF of the past. I think, Samira, you have in mind. TPLF is now composed of different elements. Its strength is different. Its capacity has been transformed. And of course, what kind of transformation they have faced is much debated. So there is a changed TPLF, which does not only incorporate the half of the segment of the former TPLF, but other groups as well, such as the Arana party and so on. So what does this current TPLF, which is composed of former TPLF, of the other Tigrayan political military group that have joined it, wants is, for me, it's not a simple answer. It's not just a comeback to power, but it's maybe part of it is that comeback of power, but then also I assume different things, yeah, different demands. So, but the question is, are these demands that they put, which Fasil says is hard to pick and choose, are they strategic demand? Are they making it for strategic purposes, or they are the end goal of their actions? Is a questions that we should also ask. Yeah, so we should make a difference between the strategy and the goal. Yeah, so they can say anything as a strategic as part of the strategic rhetoric, including coming to power or secession of Tigray or creating independent nation and so on. But then what is their real goal? Or do they have one fixed real goal, in a sense, that is that's going to to last forever. Yeah. So I don't think that that's the case. Yeah. So the goal will be shifting, and the strategies will be different, and we have a new kind of TPLF. So although the name is the same, we have within this TPLF there are different elements who have joined the former TPLF in creating the fight. Yeah. So will they agree, for example, among themselves if they come to Addis? So these are all questions that we need to ask, I think, and not the simple version.
On this note, thank you very much. First of all, I want to give a very, very, very big warm thanks to our two panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to help us clarify some of the developments in the situation in Ethiopia. I've certainly learned a lot from this webinar, and I hope the participants as well. I want to thank all the participants for taking part, for asking lots of questions, and wish you all very happy holidays and a good new year. And hopefully we will have another seminar on the same topic in a few months' time, and then we can report back on some of the other developments that have taken place in the meantime. It's a fluid situation, but we'll keep an eye on it. So thank you all very much. And thanks to Fasil and Samson for taking time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.